Hey, you all, special bonus episode this week. A lot of farmers like myself have been looking for ways to show up for the Black community right now. And one of the ways I've learned that we can all collectively do that is just to listen and amplify their stories and voices. So today, we're rebroadcasting the podcast conversation with Larisa Jacobson of Soulfire Farm. Soulfire is a nonprofit farm working to end racism and injustice in the food system. And in our conversation, Larisa discusses with me what that work looks like. She describes the challenges of being a Black or brown farmer, and we talk about what white farmers can do to be supportive of Black Americans who want to farm, and what actions we can take as white folks, which I imagine is a big portion of our listenership, to help change the racial disparities in our food and agricultural systems and in our communities. In fact, Soulfire has released today their action steps, specifically what anyone can do to help be supportive of peaceful protesters and resist anti-Black violence. So we will have a link to that in the show notes and at no-tillgrowers.com. Also, if you are looking for a great and immediate action you can take to make a difference, you can always donate directly to Soulfire Farm at soulfirefarm.org. Also, Larisa and Soulfire have a GoFundMe page set up to help build home gardens for families in Albany and Troy, New York, centering Black, Indigenous, and people of color, folks impacted by food apartheid, and survivors of mass incarceration. So that's awesome. You can support that as well. We'll put links to those in the show notes and at no-tillgrowers.com. Okay, enough from me. Let's get into this amazing conversation with the then farm manager, but now co-director and partnerships director at Soulfire Farm, Larisa Jacobson. Larisa Jacobson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So I'm super excited to have you on. I wonder if we can just start where we always start with this podcast and have you just kind of give us a little rundown of Soulfire Farm, where you all are located, how big it is, and those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. We're located in Petersburg, New York. We're about 20 minutes east of Troy, New York, and about 40 minutes east of Albany, New York. And we are an 80-acre farm dedicated to uprooting racism in the food system and seeding food and land sovereignty in the food system. About 6 acres of those are cultivated lands, and about 2 acres of those are cultivated in fruits and vegetables formerly, and now we're transitioning to more of a perennial system. But we were working on about 2 acres of vegetables, 2 acres of annuals, and our focus is on regenerating those 80 acres of land through Afro-Indigenous ancestral farming and forestry practices, and sharing the harvest of the land with people who are impacted in some way by state violence, whether that's violence by our own state, the United States, or internationally, people who have immigrated or migrated to the U.S. through forced migration. And we are also focused on equipping the next generation of Black and brown farmers through culturally relevant training, mentorship, and connecting them to resources, also healing the land-based trauma that has occurred through slavery, genocide, colonization. And finally, we're focused on mobilizing the public to create a racially just food system. So we offer talks, articles, and trainings on reparations and what we call land rematriation, returning of land to its original stewards, and policy change and action that individuals can take both themselves and at a more structural level.
That is so amazing. There's so many different things going on there. So can you talk a little bit about your role there?
Mm-hmm. I'm a co-executive director. We have 3 co-directors, and I am also the farm director. So for the past 3 years, I've managed the farm. I've done all the crop planning, all the rotation planning, all the soil health planning, and also worked very closely in leadership with our beautiful farm team that works the land. And in addition to that, provides curriculum and hands-on facilitation and training for our Black and Brown Farmer Immersion programs, which are week-long training programs for Black and Brown farmers who come to the land and heal relationship with that land and learn skills in soil health, in equipment and tools. They learn histories of racism and resistance in the food system, and they share those with us as well. We are learners in that process as well. And other skills in business planning and herbalism, all kinds of skills related to land-based life.
Okay, so that's amazing. I want to get into some of that stuff in a minute. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to Soulfire? Do you have a sort of agricultural background, or how did you arrive there?
I started farming over 20 years ago. When I was traveling around, it was a time before the internet, and the internet was there, but not very active. And at that time, there were written printed directories where you could look up farmers who needed help on their farms for pay. So I found a farm. I was trying to make some money during the summer, and I started farming as a way to make some summer income. I continued that over the years, and then I actually studied farming and agriculture and agroecology formerly at the University of California at Davis. And I came to Soulfire because I had been working for a long time in the food system and in areas of combating food apartheid, what we call food apartheid, which is a systematic lack of access to fresh food in certain neighborhoods, mostly Black and Brown neighborhoods. I had been working in food justice. I had been working in access to food for a long time and in community health. And one of the places I worked was the Food Project, where we were working on youth-led food sovereignty. And Leah Penniman, who is a co-founder of Soulfire Farm, was a young person working at the Food Project at one time. So our paths intersected in many ways. And so many of Soulfire's goals were in line with my own work and purpose. And I had been working for a long time as an apprentice and in other roles, assistant manager roles, on farms that were led almost exclusively by white people, and so experienced some degree of alienation and isolation and microaggressions. And I heard about this Black and Brown, centering in Black and Brown led farm in New York, with many of the same mission and objectives that I was trying to incorporate into my own work, and so made my way to Soulfire Farm after many years of studying and learning farming and welding and engine maintenance and agroecology and all the associated skills that come along with farming.
That's great. I wish I had any welding experience.
Yes. Welding is a great skill to have for farming, especially for DIY implements. It's really fun.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's funny. I can't even remember what it was. Something the other day. I was like, I just need to be able to weld a little piece on here, and I have literally no idea where to start.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about those agricultural practices. I kind of want to dive into that. I'll just go ahead because I think that's some of that stuff is really interesting. When I was reading Leah's book, Farming While Black, which is an excellent book, and it has a lot of great technical detail in there too. I was really taken with some of the practices. Can you talk about some of the different agricultural practices you all utilize and kind of where they derive?
Yes, for sure. So we see ourselves in honoring and uplifting the contributions and brilliance of Afro-Indigenous ancestors. We see ourselves as mediators and caregivers of the relationship between soil and sky. So we see land not as a material resource, not as something to be bought or sold or owned as it is under what we call presently white man's law or settler colonialist law, but as an elder or a collective of beings. And so part of what is inherent to what we consider Afro-Indigenous ancestral practices is recognizing the fullness and the beauty of this ecosystem, the interconnectedness of this collective of beings, and understanding that we as humans are just one part of that collective. And so much of life, 99% of the life on this planet is in the soil. So we are a very small part of that, and our role is to understand and to mediate the relationship between that life and its release to the sky. So our ancestors understood and created and innovated many practices that sequester carbon in the soil and respect the life and the fullness of that ecosystem in the soil. And so some of those might be minimal disturbance of the soil, cover cropping, ways of working to minimize erosion, caring for the trees and all of their intricate and integral ecosystems as a beautiful part of the land, like fungal mycelia and the creatures that depend on the ecosystems of tree roots, intercropping, understanding how you can contribute back to the soil through mulching and adding of organic matter in various forms like living or green manures, recognizing and uplifting the contributions too of tools and practices that have been created. For example, the hoe originated in Africa. So we honor those origins and we name those explicitly, recognizing the contributions of Black Americans, such as George Washington Carver, who focused on taking organic matter from the forest, leaf matter, and bringing it into agricultural spaces, and also doing a large amount of leguminous cover cropping and respecting that relationship between rhizobial bacteria and the roots of the plant. So we do all of that, and also thinking about water conservation and food preservation methods, how much of the irrigation that has come to be in our present time was innovated in parts of North and West Africa. Food preservation, so many techniques that we use come to us from West Africa. Seed preservation and pest management, even the use, we use the product that a lot of people use, Surround, which is based on kale and clay, and that technique of using a kind of scratchy irritant to deter insects from attacking seeds or attacking crops. That's a very ancient ancestral North and West African technology to mix seeds and to apply kale and clay to crops. So we use many techniques that you might recognize from what's called organic or regenerative or natural farming, but we attribute those and we name them and we uplift their origins in ancestral practices.
That's cool. Can you? Well, one thing I really love George Washington Carver. I found after reading the Farming While Black, I started to read a little bit more about George Washington Carver, and his contributions are incredible. I mean, the things that he did with peanuts and sweet potatoes and cover crops are extraordinary. I mean, he wrote several papers that are still really profound.
Yes. And there was such heart in his work too, because not just was he a farming and ecosystem enthusiast, but he was a food enthusiast. So his love for the nitrogen benefits of cowpeas extended not just to their agricultural uses, but to their food uses. And he named such things as the fact that iron and clay cowpeas, it's a variety of cowpeas, sustained freed African Americans after the Civil War, and he wrote recipes for them, and he embraced all their deliciousness and nutrition and sustenance for Black Americans at that time. So he brought a lot of heart and life into his science as well.
Yeah, and speaking of at that time, I mean, this was like Jim Crow South. This was like, this is it was a really dangerous time for somebody to be as in Black and intelligent and and empowering. And it was amazing what he was able to do not just against that, but also to bring a lot of people together. He was very much a uniter. He has a really extraordinary story.
For sure. And other elders at Tuskegee University, like Booker T. Watley, who came up really with the concept of community-supported agriculture, CSAs, and pick your own, this idea that people would pay in up front to invest in a farm and then have a share of that farm and have that type of relationship with a farm. So we honor him as well. And out of Tuskegee came one of the first agricultural extension services too. So it was called the Jessup Wagon, and it went around to farms and it brought seeds and technical assistance and resources and information and fertilizer to farmers in the South. And it was a Black extension service, and those origins are often forgotten.
Yeah, that's really neat. I actually didn't know about that one. And I feel like I didn't know a lot about several of the people that are mentioned in her book, but also several things that George Washington Carver did and contributions that we still use today. So it's great that that you all are doing that work to get those voices kind of brought back out.
Yes.
I'd like to kind of just get back to the indigenous the sort of practices, the Afro-Indigenous practices that we were talking about, and maybe you could give us a few specific examples, and then how you implement them.
Yes, for sure. So I can give a perennial example, and I can give an annual example that you might use in a market garden too. So in terms of perennials, the example that I'd love to give is what we call a jardin la cour, which is Haitian Creole for courtyard garden, and that's would be called in other terms an agroforestry orchard. So we have this area that was extremely eroded, where all the topsoil over the years had washed down the hill through the way that the land had been managed before, and rain and natural erosion over time. And what we did, many people participated in this process. So we have hundreds of volunteers a year who helped out with this. And over time, so many people's stories and contributions and labor have been interwoven into this Jardin la Cour. But what it is essentially is a terraced orchard where we have tree branches interwoven, and then the topsoil was brought back up the hill, which is also a practice that we can attribute and honor the East African practice of fanyaju, which comes from Kenya, which means throw the soil up the hill, because there was an understanding that you had to retain and care for your topsoil and try to keep it on your slopes and hold the slope. So the topsoil was brought up the hill both by tractor and by hand to make these terraces held by these baskets of tree branches. And on top of that, it was mulched with wood chips to encourage fungal ecosystems. And those also help hold that slope with their mycelia. And into that is planted fruit and nut trees, primarily apple trees in that spot. In other spots, we have hazelnut trees and woody bushes like elderberries or other types of berries. And around those trees are rings of low-growing crops like chives, medicinal herbs like lemon balm and mint, echinacea, bee balm, and many different other medicinal herbs. And the function of those, it's an integrated ecosystem. The chives help deter pests. The bee balm and the echinacea draw pollinators and create habitat. The medicinal herbs are used for human medicine and also many times attract beneficial insects that help with pests. The bee balm we plant in tribute to the original stewards of our land, who were the Mohican people, who now live primarily on the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation Reservation in Wisconsin, where they were forcibly displaced. And bee balm is a much beloved medicine called number 6. It's called number 6 because it's like the number 6 medicine in the nation. and we plant that in tribute and as habitat. So these low-growing crops also help hold the slope. We have comfrey there as well. The tree roots stabilize the slope, and all of those work together. So that's one example in a perennial system that we have going. And then in annual systems, we try to avoid bare ground as much as possible. We're on a very sloped area. We have clay soil that can turn to a hard cement if there's erosion or a strong wash of rain. We have tremendous weeds that maybe we'll talk about at some point. We have a lot of weed struggles. And so there are many reasons to cover the ground and conserve moisture and conserve the slope and the topsoil. And so we do a lot of polycultures, which again, we owe reverence and debt for those polycultures to West African and other African and indigenous ways of planting. In many cases, in Africa, for example, yams and legumes and then a tree crop are planted together. For us, in a really practical sense, what we might do is seed a salad mix and then transplant a brassica into that. And so we have essentially a living mulch of salad mix. We get 2 to 3 cuts out of that. And by the time that's cut, we get the heading and the flowering of the brassica, for example, broccoli, and we cut the broccoli and then it's done. And we've kept the full surface of the bed covered for that entire time. We also interplant things like what is called cempasúchil or marigold or calendulas that host hoverflies and other beneficial insects. And we cover ground in that way by planting those pollinator and beneficial host plants. We do a great deal of cover cropping. We mulch a good deal with straw or leaf matter from the forest. Or wood chips in different places. So those are some of the practices that we owe reverence to our ancestors for.
I love that, and I love the language that you use. I think that one thing that we shy away from, generally when we're talking about market gardening, is speaking about it in terms of with any sort of spirituality involved. And I think that it's really refreshing to hear people speaking about it, especially with intention.
Yes.
And is there how does that work for you? Is that something that really inspired you about this farm, or is that something that you kind of brought to the farm, or how did that come into play?
I think everyone brings something to the farm, and we are such a collective. But it's definitely something that, again, we're uplifting about our ancestral practices, is that spirituality and that reverence and that approach to soil health and to farming cannot be separated from the technical aspects of it, that it is so inherent. Leah, for example, talks about being with farmers and the queen mothers in Ghana and them expressing total surprise that anyone would plant a seed without praying and singing over it. And so something that I didn't mention yet, but that we do very much, is to offer prayer and song and dance and joy to the soil and to our crops. One example is that our small farm team, which is very small, we had about the equivalent of 3 full-time people for the season. For the farm team side of things, we have about 7 or 8 staff for the whole organization. Every time we were going to harvest for the CSA, we did a land ritual and we offered thanks and gratitude to the soil and the land and the original stewards of the land. And during the Black and Brown Farmers Immersion programs that I mentioned, we often drum and dance and offer laughter and song and call and response and poetry to the land. And that is so integral to how we practice farming. And it's something that many of us bring and contribute to, and it becomes this interwoven fabric of how we farm at Soulfire. And again, it's inextricable from how we farm. I can nerd out about so many technical aspects of farming and mechanical aspects and equipment and soil science, and so many of us can, but that spiritual aspect is just as important and just as woven into the fabric of how we're farming.
Yeah, it's great because so much of it, I keep thinking about like the sort of toil of farming. And when you don't have that sort of spiritual connection, it's maybe harder to find that joy in it. And I think about, like, with fear of sounding like I'm reducing what you all are doing to a simple word, it sounds satisfying to think about, maybe bringing in some of that history that gets forgotten or buried, and then bringing also all of this, the sort of spiritual side, the reverence, praying over seeds like that. There's something about that sounds really attractive to me.
Yes, it's a lifeblood, and it's a calling. And also, when we think about climate resilience and climate mitigation, which are very important to us as well, we can think about the fact that our ancestors' bones are flying to the sky. That's how I put it. And I am thinking not just of our human ancestors, but of our tree ancestors and our other ancestors, because we are living in this collective of beings, so that we have this obligation to take on this role as mediators of the relationship between soil and sky, because we are creating a home on this planet, and agriculture is one of the most intimate ways to be in relationship with that home. So we have this sacred obligation, this sacred role, and we do believe that joy is a part of that. At the same time, I don't want to minimize the hard work that is involved. There's sometimes when we're crying over the earth, or at times we've done mourning ceremonies where we dig a hole into the soil and we shout and cry and sing and weep into the soil. And it's very hard labor. And I think we made a transition from very full aggressive tillage to reduced, and in some cases no till. And that transition was hard. And I don't want to minimize the labor of that transition either, because I think it's important to presence and talk about the labor that occurs in farming too, and the mental and emotional health challenges that occur in farming, the sustainability challenges, the burdens and the fears that elder farmers face as they think about their bodies and how their farm might be passed through the generations, and whether the land might be lost, particularly for Black and Brown farmers. So all of those things are important to acknowledge too. The spiritual engagement with the land definitely helps and brings joy, and we offer our joy to the land, but we understand that there is hard work involved, and that it's a matter of survival and thrival, and it's not always easy.
Yeah. I think about what you were just saying a little bit about mental health, and I guess, in terms of, like, when I used the word toil earlier, I think that having something that is, like, maybe greater than yourself gives it a little bit more, some sort of inspiration to get through that. Do you feel as though that helps in terms of just, like, on a physical day-to-day basis?
Yes, we definitely feel as if we are, I'll speak for myself at least, that I am working to honor the stories and the history and the contributions of ancestors, and to honor my place on the land, and that picks me up when things are really hard, or when we have a day where things are breaking and nothing is going well, and we're having labor challenges and staff challenges and challenges with weeds and soil and things like that. It can definitely help to remember that purpose.
I want to just change gears a little bit and get in a little bit of that information about how the CSA works.
Yeah. Okay, so we have until the end of this year, and I can talk a little bit about the transition that we're going through, but until the end of this year, for 8 years, we had a CSA which steadily grew over time. And it started because Leah Penniman and Jonah Vitale Wolf, who are the co-founders of Soulfire Farm, were living in the South End neighborhood of Albany, which is a neighborhood that's impacted deeply by food apartheid, the lack of access to fresh, affordable, culturally relevant food. And neighbors had asked them to create a farm for the people. So they created the farm, and the CSA started very small, just 10 households or so, bringing vegetables and eggs. And over the years, it grew. And part of why it grew most recently is because we wanted to demonstrate the capacity, even though we're a nonprofit organization as of 2016, for our aspiring farmers and learners, we wanted to demonstrate financial viability, that it is possible to run a business that is sliding scale and makes food very available in a culturally relevant, accessible way to people who are low income, who are experiencing food apartheid, who might have EBT SNAP benefits. So we had a sliding scale CSA. In 2019, we were partnering with 110 households, which we consider to be about 300 to 400 people. And 21 of those members were solidarity shares, which are shares that are distributed totally free of charge to those members. And those were set aside for people who are identified as immigrants, refugees, or people impacted by state violence, whether that's the violence of forced migration or the violence of the prison injustice system in this country. We partnered with the Center for Law and Justice in Albany, which is an organization that works with people returning to life from the prison injustice system, to offer food through their wellness clinic. We partnered with the West Hill Refugee Center to offer food for migrant-led cooking classes. And the 110 CSA shares are sliding scale. So we have a sliding scale that went from $23 a week on up to $50 a week if people wanted to subsidize and support shares for their neighbors. Within that box, we did a 20-week CSA, mostly doorstep delivered. So there are 40 doorstep delivery spots, because one of the prime barriers to accessing CSAs in general, food shares, is transportation and physically getting there to pick it up. So those were delivered right to people's doorsteps. And we spoke with members each year to find out what they liked, what their preferences are, what they wanted to be cooking and eating with, how we could incorporate foods that were culturally relevant and resonant for people. We included a lot of medicinal herbs as well. And we did a lot of conversations and meetings and community checking in over the winter to make sure that the farm share was meeting people's needs. It's a predominantly Black and Brown member farm share. 75% of members were people of color. And now we're transitioning a bit out of that model. So we're no longer going to be doing a CSA as of 2020. We'll be focusing more on solidarity share distribution in partnership with community-based organizations, mostly jams, preserves, meat, eggs, medicinal herbs, and other herbal products, and honey and mushrooms, and mostly vegetables and fruits just for our programs on the farm primarily. But that farm share definitely held a lot of meaning, and we are very carefully planning the transition for people who have been in close relationship with a farm share over many years.
Can I ask what drove that transition from the CSA model to the one you just described?
So for over the years, we've been thinking about sustainability, and what makes sense both for the land and the people on the land. And one struggle that we've had, one challenge, is that as our programs have expanded, we welcome thousands of people every year to the land, and hundreds of people each year through our farmer immersion programs, and then we have one-day workshops. Our human habitat and infrastructure on the land has not yet kept up with that. And so we were thinking a lot about safe, warm housing for our farm staff, and how people can live sustainably and share that community space together. And also the labor challenges that arise, the transition from tillage to reduced or low till. We're dealing with a large weed seed bank, a lot of perennial weeds, and there were a lot of labor challenges in that transition, and thinking about also how we can more fully inhabit and live into our role as an educational farm for so many aspiring farmers, Black and brown farmers who are coming to our farm every year, who want to learn all different kinds of micro enterprises that they might use on their own, and also just land-based skills for self-determination and sustenance. We wanted to diversify the things that we were able to show to people and respect the fact that our human habitat is limited on the farm right now. And we do have an effort that is just ramping up to increase that habitat and increase our capacity to welcome people to the farm in more permanent structures. And there will be more said about that soon, a campaign to raise some funds for that. But in the meantime, we wanted to kind of prune the tomato, I guess we're saying, and really focus on what we're doing well and how we can make this work sustainable for ourselves who are doing the work too, and for the land that we're working on.
Earlier, you sort of mentioned that you had transitioned from like a tillage system into more of a minimal or low or no-till, some mix of those. Can you talk about that transition and then also some of the things that you've implemented?
Yes. So when the current farm team came in, what we found is that there was such a hard tiller pan and such a cementing of our clay loam soil through erosion and through the washing of the soils that had been pulverized that transplanting was almost like punching your hand into a cement wall when we went to put our seedlings into the earth, and many of the beds were eroded. And in addition to that, we saw yellow nutsedge everywhere, propagated through its nutlets spread everywhere. We saw Canada thistle, which was propagated essentially through root pieces. And we saw places in which there was severe compaction due to this powdering of the soil and then the soil washing down into this clay table. So besides the fact that we wanted to honor Afro-Indigenous ancestral practices and become more climate resilient, we also wanted to call back in the soil ecosystems that might have been disrupted by this process. So we really looked toward ways that we could reduce, or in some cases eliminate, tillage. We saw tarping or silage tarps as one gateway out of tillage and a tool that we could use to support that transition, both in terms of weeds and soil health through nutrient cycling and helping with residue breakdown and warming the soil communities, and doing, quote, biological tillage. We engaged a lot more cover cropping. There was already straw mulching being done, but we wanted to make sure that by the time winter and that freeze-thaw process came along, most of the land was covered in some type of living or mulch cover. We increased the rotation. We do rotational grazing with chickens, so we increase the rotational grazing of chickens as a soil health input. And the transition was hard because we we're very challenged by these grasses that have been spread, the perennial weeds. There were a number of annual weeds that the seed bank was really high, and the labor transition was hard for us. We went from a great deal of tractor drawn work, still a lot less than I think a lot of other places that use tractors, not as many passes, but we minimize those, and so we minimize fossil fuel use even more. And we tried different methods. We tried broad forking. We've tried hand scale methods, and then we also ended up getting a market farm chisel plow. It was a 5-tine chisel plow, but we took off 2 of the tines because our tractor is only 40 horsepower. It's about 10 horsepower per chisel. So we ended up with this combination system where we're using a chisel plow and tarping, and now as we transition to a perennial system primarily and many fewer annuals, to a no-till system, and much of our sections were no-till last year. We also fallow a section every year, which we do in a sequence of tarping and then a mid-season cover crop, and then a late season cover crop that's winter killed, and then we plant into the mulch of that the following year. So we've come to some peace and some balance with the weed situation, and with using combinations of biotello and paper mulch and wood chips and straw, and experimenting with living mulches in the pathways. But it hasn't been an easy transition for us, for sure. It's been very worth it when you see the soil now. It's this incredibly rich, dark, kind of brownie crumb aggregate and pore and beautiful soil that you can sink your hand into and transplant with almost without using a tool of any kind. But that transition has been difficult for us.
Yeah. Do you have any, in terms of those cover crops and stuff that you're using, do you have any ones that are really working for you up there?
Yes. So this sequence, so we've struggled a lot with tarping, and I know silage tarping is really in right now, and we've used it in a lot of different ways. And one of the ways that it's been really successful for us is as a way of holding ground before a cover. So just keeping that land in a kind of stasis without weeds on it and letting some biological tillage happen under the earth with the warming in the early season before we're going to do a mid-season cover. So then we would do a mid-season buckwheat and get 2 cuts out of the buckwheat, and then end in an oats peas. Another thing that's been really successful for us is if we do a mid-season cover and then we do in the Northeast, it's like an August planting of sorghum Sudan grass, or Sudex, mixed with Crotalaria juncea, which is also called sun hemp with a double N on the sun. That way you get a lot of biomass. You get the allelopathic effect of the sorghum Sudan, which is beautiful. You get the deep root mass and deep root channeling, and then you get the nitrogen fixation of the sun hemp. We also do an annual rye vetch mix on things, and we underseed that. So if we have, for example, late season brassicas on a straw mulch, we seed right into that straw mulch with the rye vetch mix, and then if we get the timing right, it comes up in the fall and it can get mowed in, or otherwise, if we're late on the timing, which is often the case in the fall because there's lots of things happening in the fall, then the seed just sits there and it comes up in the spring and you get a nice cover in the spring, and then you can mow that in the spring. Triticale, so Triticale vetch is another beautiful combo because Triticale is really easily terminated with a tarp. Sometimes you might have trouble terminating rye with a tarp because they have different growth patterns and stem elongation and timing. So if you mix Triticale and vetch, you can much more easily time the termination point between the Triticale and the vetch. And if you're experimenting with tarping, that's a really nice combo to terminate with a tarp because it can terminate the cover crop at the right time and then help a little bit with residue breakdown, and then you can plant into the mulch from that.
That's great. And with that triticale mix, are you mowing that and then tarping it? Or are you pressing it down and then tarping it? How does that work?
So people do it in all different ways, and it really depends on your equipment. We have a bush hog, so we would usually mow it and then tarp it. But I know people who, a smaller scale, or if they don't have a mower of any kind, are actually attaching wide wood boards to their feet or snowshoes to their feet, and they tamp it down and they kind of like roll and crimp it by their feet before they tarp it. So there are all kinds of different things you can do. I think probably the best result is if you can tamp it down in some way, or mow it before you can tarp it. Otherwise, you risk that it just persists under the tarp depending on the weather conditions.
And then are you doing a lot with compost?
So we do use compost. We, at this point, buy in compost though. So for many years, compost was being applied as, again, a primary form of weed control, and all of the nitrogen-based fertility was aiming to come from compost, and it was being applied as a compost mulch in essence, and to create soil loft and tilth. But what we saw from that was a heavy phosphorus accumulation and other macronutrient accumulations because of the balance of the compost that was being used and being applied. So we scaled way back on our compost applications, also because we wanted to have a more self-sustaining system and not buy in as many inputs. And we did turn toward using some alfalfa meal, organic alfalfa meal, and some pelleted chicken manure for fertility for that early season nitrogen before mineralization can really occur because of the temperatures. We're pretty far north, and it's cold, and the soil is cold, and compost has a slower release. And we wanted to avoid some of that macronutrient accumulation, which can lead to more weed problems and can also lead to micronutrient uptake problems. So we scaled way back on our compost applications, and we use it more now as a dusting for the ecosystem benefits and for some degree of fertility and soil stability and fostering of soil life, but use it much less as a mulch or as the primary driver of nitrogen in the soil. That might change over time, but that's what we've come to at this point.
Yeah, you all are doing so many. When you were kind of giving me the outline of what you all were doing, there's so many amazing things going in there. But I imagine just on a day-to-day level that balancing all that and doing it up to your standards and those sorts of things can, like, I'm just imagining from any nonprofit standpoint, that can be a challenge.
Yes, it's very challenging, and we have a very high standard of excellence. And we feel that we owe that excellence to the people who are blessing us with their presence on the farm, the learner, activist farmers who are coming, all of the community members who are coming, and to our ancestors who are honoring through the work. So in order to keep that up, we have a very small staff, and we're doing a lot, and we're working nationally and internationally. And we felt it was important to focus in and really make sure that we could sustain and nourish the parts of what we're doing that are vital and that are thriving.
Yeah, and I think I kind of want to talk a little bit about one of the things that you're doing in terms of the training Black and brown farmers. And I think it'd be interesting for the listenership to kind of hear why there needs to be a place for Black and brown farmers. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean that genuinely, because I think I didn't realize this until I started reading through her book, how being a Black or brown farmer and going to a farming conference, you're not seeing a lot of people that look like you.
Mm-hmm.
So can you kind of describe what that's like, and then how you all approach that and how you're trying to kind of empower Black and brown farmers?
Yes. So in order to do that, I'll take a step back for a minute to talk about the food system in this country, which I think is often not talked about explicitly. So what we're also trying to understand is that the food system in this country is founded on stolen land and stolen labor. So going back to the genocide of First Nations people on the land and the forced displacement and forced assimilation of Indigenous people in Turtle Island, and then slavery, the forced migration and forced labor and kidnapping of millions of people from Africa to come to this country to build the agricultural economy of this country. And then continued forced migration over the years, and then forced land loss by Black farmers. So in 1910, you had 14% of the nation's farms being operated by Black farmers. And today you have about 1.5% of the nation's farms being operated by Black farmers. Over 12 million acres were lost to racialized violence and legal discrimination and systematic discrimination by the USDA in loans and technical assistance and other supports. So you have this tremendous loss in Black and brown farmers. At the same time, in our current food system, you have 85% of the people working the land being Latine or Latinx, Latina, Latino, migrant workers, and only 2.5% of farms are owned and operated by Latinx people. You also can look at government assistance or subsidies and see that over 97% of government assistance related to agriculture is going to farms that are operated by European descended people or white people. And you see that people who are working the land in the system are not protected by labor laws in the same way as people working in other industries. They don't have the same rights to overtime and days off, fair wages, collective bargaining. And to this day, you see that Indigenous people have been dispossessed of their land, and that claims to land continue to be denied by the settler colonialists who now occupy this land. So within that context, we have Black and brown farmers who often are hoping to secure land tenure for either sustainable farming or human habitat or ceremony or native ecosystem restoration or cultural preservation, and often that is denied or not supported by the system. And since so many of the farms in this day and age in this country are owned and operated by white people, European descended people, it can be a tremendously alienating, isolating, discriminatory, and structurally racist experience to try to learn farming, to go and train on those farms, to repair relationship with land. Additionally, you have the agricultural extension system in this country often operating out of land-grant universities. And so when we think of land-grant universities, we often think of the land that was granted to them being the footprint that they're occupying or they're doing their research on, trials on. But in addition to that, land was granted to land-grant universities in this country as a form of capital. So much of the economy and the wealth of those universities came from selling and trading stolen land that was stolen from Indigenous people through genocide and after railway claims that happened later on too, and claims of land in the West that were taken from Mexican settlers. So we see this whole system that is built on oppression and exploitation, and within that system, technical assistance and research and knowledge are primarily developed through these institutions that are embedded into that system. And so as a Black and brown farmer, if you want to learn farming, the resources available to you and the landscape and the places available to welcome you are almost primarily operated by the descendants of the people who came later on or who occupied the land and participated in the system of stolen land and stolen labor. So what we're trying to do is create a place where people can come and learn and work alongside people who look like them, who share ancestral practices, and who recognize that there was this trauma that was wrought on the land. There's a farmer in Philly who's brilliant named Chris Bolden Newsom, a Black farmer. And he says that the land was the scene of the crime. The land was not the crime itself. So there is a great deal of healing of trauma that needs to occur on land because so much of this oppression and exploitation occurred on land, but the land was not the perpetrator of that.
That's great. That idea, I mean, I wonder, and I know that other people have mentioned this as well, about as somebody who grows up Black, brown, but with this history of slavery, how farming, how they feel about farming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have youth who come to the farm at various times who have come to the farm who have said, I don't want to have soil on my shoes, or I don't want to do this. It's slavery work or it's stoop work. And so there's this whole relationship with farming and with the land and with nature that needs to be healed, because distancing from that relationship and deprivation of that relationship is also something that wreaks havoc and damage to people's well-being as well. There's so many studies that show that relationship with nature is really fundamentally important to mental and emotional health, and school success, and resistance and immunity to diseases and things like that. So we understand relationship with land as a key component of thriving as a Black and brown person in this society.
Yeah, and then there's got to also be quite a bit of, I mean, there's a struggle with anybody wanting to get land. What does land access look like from that perspective?
It's very difficult because, again, there's this history of structural discrimination. There are often barriers for people who are hoping to apply for loans or find capital in some way. You see a tremendous wealth gap already. There's a 13-to-1 white to Black wealth gap in this country, because 80% of wealth in this country is inherited. And the way that land tenure and land acquisition works now, with the way that land has been conceived of as a material resource under settler colonial law, is that you need capital to either acquire land or secure land tenure over years. And so much of what we talk about as regenerative farming, or farming in relationship with the earth, depends on a longer-term relationship with that land, getting to know that land intimately and being in a relationship with it over not just years in your lifetime, but over generations. And so we have all of these structures that disrupt inheritance and intergenerational continuity of relationship with land for Black and brown people in this country, and for Black farmers specifically. And economic viability for Black and brown farmers is also really difficult, because there may be barriers to accessing the funding that does exist for farmers, the loan assistance, crop insurance, things like that, technical assistance. Like I mentioned, the agricultural cooperative extension system in this country is very white, and so information might be inaccessible or transmitted in a way that's not culturally relevant, or does not seem available to Black and brown farmers. things like equipment sharing or cooperatives or communities of farmers helping each other out in an interdependent way. Those may often be exclusive or isolating for Black and brown farmers. Access to markets, access to startup equipment and tools and things like that. All of these elements are more challenging for Black and brown farmers in this country.
So I guess that kind of leads to another question of how would people who are already established be able to, how could they help with that? How could they assist in maybe offering land or those sorts of things? Like, what are some models maybe you've seen, or what are some ideas you all have?
Great. So I'm on the board for the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. We are a land trust operated and coordinated by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and we're focused on transforming this conception of land that has come to be in this country through colonization and slavery and forced migration and genocide. We focus on permanent and secure land tenure for farmers of color, again, for sustainable farming or habitat or ceremony or native ecosystem restoration or cultural preservation. And our goal is to rematriate land and to catalyze reparations for Black and brown farmers. So people can work directly with organizations such as the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. There are other land trusts forming all over the country that are devoted to this concept of reparations and land rematriation, transfer of resources and land to farmers of color, to the original stewards of the land, to people who have been forced for generations to work the land, Black farmers in this country. And so that's one example. We have a reparations map also. It's a map of Northeast-based Black and brown farmers who are starting or have started farming and food justice projects and are in need of resources and capital. And you can access that map on our website at soulfirefarm.org. That's one way to help out in a very immediate, tangible way. Another way to help is to activate for policy change. So, for example, to contact your elected representatives. People always say that, but I don't know if people do that in response when people say that. So to really get in touch with people in power, in elected power, and tell them to support such things as the Fairness for Farm Workers Act, to enforce a moratorium of the government seizure of Black land, to pay attention to the needs and the history of Black farmers in this country, and to pass HR 40 to begin the reparations process, to take real legal action to begin the reparations process. You can also use your own, or if you're associated with an institution, you could use your own or the institutional consumer and purchasing power to support Black and brown farmers, or to support operations that are promoting leadership by Black and brown farmers. If you don't have money or capital or land to offer, there's always the offer of time, experience, technical assistance to projects either on the reparations map or other Black and brown farmers or other grassroots community organizations. We are also in coalitions with the Heal Food Alliance and the Black Food Injustice Alliance. There's a whole list of organizations on our website that are working for food and land sovereignty in this country and recognizing this history of the food system in this country, and working in very concrete ways for food and land sovereignty. There's so many ways in which individuals can plug in and support and make use of their own brilliance and talents and resources and power and privilege in different ways.
If let's say you're a farmer like myself, and we're totally cool with anybody coming to the farm, how do we make that? Do you have any recommendations for how somebody would, if you're safe here, it's we're happy to train you to be a sustainable farmer. What are some ways in which we can advertise that? Would that be the right way of putting it?
I think probably for a lot of people, the first step is doing a deep dive into some of this embedded racism in the food system. So really understanding the roots and the manifestations of your own privilege and power and the history of the food system and how that might come up on a daily basis in both big and little ways. I think it's also forming relationships with existing Black and brown farmer mentor elders and learning from them, and really taking the lead from people who might be wanting to come and learn, or people who are already doing the work and asking questions, and thinking about what structures and what practices and what cultures have been developed to create those safe spaces for people, and just a continual process of checking in and questioning and humility, cultural humility, which I think is hard and challenging for many people. And also, I think in some cases, it's about supporting existing farms or farmers who are doing the work that are already Black and brown centered or Black and brown led. I think a lot of times people want to help in various ways, but some of the best ways might be talking to other white people, for example, about how they can be active and how they can make transformative change, or supporting projects that are already led by Black and brown people, supporting places where people are finding mentorship and finding learning opportunities already. So it might be any combination of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think supporting other people who are already doing it makes a ton of sense on so many levels, because I think about like there are already a lot of people doing it, and there's so many good opportunities, like all the ones that you gave us, all the ones that you listed, to be able to contribute to that. And yeah, I don't know, like my brain goes to what my wife has kind of pointed out, like this idea of I don't know if the right term is white saviorism, but that sort of idea of like, oh, just come to me and I'll take care of it, or whatever it is. And like you said, sort of addressing your own privileges and those sorts of things, which is great, because it's something that's challenging. I mean, it's challenging to me just to think about, like you said, the cultural challenges. But I think, yeah, supporting those programs that already exist is a really, like that. If you really want to do something, that's super exciting that they're already there and ready to be helped.
Yes, it's really key, and taking their lead and asking questions and listening with a full and open heart. It's so important to the process.
I mean, is there anything in there that you think that doesn't get enough attention in terms of Black and brown farmers, access to land and those sorts of things? I know we've covered a lot there, but is there anything that maybe doesn't get enough attention even still?
I think there are a few things. So community-based farmer training is really important. So land is central, obviously. Land tenure is central, like I mentioned, intergenerational land tenure, and the ability to not own land, but to accumulate and retain and pass intergenerational wealth over time is important. So as part of the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, in addition to cultural easements, which I should mention too, cultural easements are legal permits for the original stewards of the land often, or other people, to come and be on the land for ceremony, for burials, for fishing, for hunting, for growing, for other forms of relationship with the land. So in addition to cultural easements, we are thinking about 99-year inheritable leases, and the fact that any capital improvements on the land would be able to be passed intergenerationally, to recognize that intergenerational wealth in our capitalist system in this country is really important to thriving for Black and Brown communities. So that's one thing that is often overlooked is how can we be relationship with the land in a way where people can also safeguard and pass through their families intergenerational capital, even if we're not owning the land, quote, owning the land. Debt forgiveness programs are really important. Refinancing loans for Black farmers. Looking at the ways in which mass incarceration in this country is tied in to USDA subsidies. So people who have been victims, we call them victims because it's an injustice system, victims of mass incarceration or survivors of mass incarceration are ineligible for USDA programs and currently. So as you know, the mass incarceration system in this country is primarily populated by Black and Brown people, and then those people become ineligible for USDA programs as returning citizens. They are unable to obtain USDA support for their farms should they decide to farm. Urban farmers are communities that are often overlooked by programs providing technical support. Again, really investing in farmer training programs that are led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color farmers and that explicitly address trauma and history and think about how do you navigate in a racist food system. And can those programs bear credit or bear some kind of institutional value through land-grant universities, through some of the institutions that have profited and essentially founded their existence on stolen land and labor. Land link programs are really important too, connecting Black, Indigenous, people of color farmers with land that's available or land that might be passing from an elder farmer. Non-predatory credit and capital is important, loans that are not predatory, and again, really underlining the way that research and technical assistance and information is made available to farmers in this country and how farmers participate in exchanging that information. I still go to farming conferences and find that many of them are predominantly white. There are conferences that are founded and centering and organized by Black, Indigenous, and people of color farmers, like the Black Farmers and Urban Gardeners Conference, the Bugs Conference. There are conferences that are becoming more inclusive and more led by Black and Brown farmers, but this is still something that is a rarity. So all these places where farmers are exchanging information in an informal way, which is the primary way that I get my information, like I nerd out on all kinds of articles and I read all the technical stuff and I have a relationship with extension and all of that, which is in some cases unusual because those things can be really foreboding and culturally irrelevant and provided in a way that disrespects Black and Brown farmers. But I do all of that, but then I can still go to these places where information is exchanged informally and be in all white groups of farmers. And there's no one there that looks like me, and I have to navigate that space. And I love getting information from other farmers. That's a amazing and important and primary way to get information and really talk things through, especially technical information. but those spaces are often predominantly white.
Yeah, and it seems as though that all of the main conferences are working to change that.
Yes.
That doesn't mean it's going to change as significantly maybe as it needs to. We had a conference recently, not a conference, like a small no-till intensive, and there was nobody, persons of color. There was also, but there was one transgender person who wrote us later and commented on the lack of diversity. And it actually really struck me because it hadn't occurred to me during the event at all. Like, it had not crossed my mind once, which I think is probably typical of being just a white dude in my world, you know? But, you know, I was really like, I wanted to be more conscious of that. And I'm wondering if you have any tips for how maybe that could be better managed.
Whenever I think about a space, and whenever we think about spaces, even as part of our uprooting racism trainings that we offer, because we do offer one-day workshops on the farm and nationally to organizations looking at organizational transformation and thinking about uprooting racism in the food system. We think about the organizational structure, and we have a whole scheme and a way for thinking about decision-making and power within institutions, even whether the institution is a farm or like a conference or a sustainable agriculture body that's organizing a conference. And the way that I think those things change is when there's real institutional change, and when Black and Brown people are in leadership and have real decision-making power that is not tokenized, and is not an add-on or an afterthought. And so for some of the conferences, you might see all of the organizers being white and then thinking almost in a tokenistic way as an afterthought that we need to presence people of color and we need to be sure to be inclusive or create, quote, diversity. But that leadership and that power within the institution or the organizational process is not there. It's not inherent to the creation of that event or that gathering. And I think that's really fundamental in this. And I do see places and organizations that are trying to transform that and to make sure that Black and Brown people are in leadership positions in a real, meaningful way, not a tokenistic way, and that those people have a voice and have power in organizing these spaces. And I think that is what creates a truly inclusive space or a forum where people can exchange information.
That's great, because the last thing that I think myself or anybody that's doing the organization would want to do is tokenize, but also to create a space that's safe. So, like, just thinking about it more holistically like that, in the same way that you would think about a farm, and having the diversity from the ground up.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really great, and I think I love how candid you are about these challenges of, you know, Black and Brown culture trying to make it in agriculture. I think we tiptoe around you know, Native American conversations, anything about that. We always tiptoe around that. We tiptoe around slavery. We try and just say it's done, it's over, that's gone. And I know I used this word earlier, but there is something refreshing about having somebody who just is willing to take that on head on.
Yeah, I think we're all living it. So we've had no choice but to take it on because we're living it every day, and some of us in varying degrees. And it's so essential for our future, for all of our futures, with the land and in this country as it is today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't think of it that way. As a white dude farming, I don't think about those things, and so it's nice to. I don't think about the fact that you're living with those things that we tiptoe around,
Mm.
and and I think that's important. I think that's important to do. For myself, it's certainly not doesn't come easy. Like it's not a natural thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's very but it feels good to know that I've been missing that part, and
Mm.
I appreciate that you're so willing to put it right out in front.
Thank you for naming that. We appreciate it. Thank you. You made me think of something else too when you said from the ground up, um, and thinking about the roots of how organizations and institutions grow and form. I was just thinking about, as we were talking, one of the founding aspects of this country that is now the United States was this westward expansion, and thinking about roots and thinking about the below ground too, and how institutions formed. I just wanted to bring that back in a sense to tillage too, and to ecosystems, to bring it full circle. So as European settlers were displacing indigenous people across North America, they were tilling the lands. And within a generation, over 50% of the original organic matter from the soil was driven into the sky as carbon dioxide. So these prairie loam soils that had 8% organic matter or more ended up with less than 4%. The productivity as a result of the soils also decreased by something like 70% in the Great Plains, this really rich region of the country. And in that generation, that was the first rise in carbon dioxide levels. And the reason why I mention this, because as above, so below. So as you were talking about from the ground up and the roots of institutions, I was thinking about the below ground and how there was forced migration and forced displacement of these microbial ecosystems that we engage so much with as farmers, and how the roots of this country and the institutions as they exist now, and as we've been talking about them in this conversation, are rooted in the displacement, not just of the humans and the animals on the above ground, but on this below ground displacement and forced migration of all of the communities that are vital to the soil and that we have to be in relationship with if we're going to do regenerative farming or farming that respects the land.
That's great, Larisa. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been an amazing conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for reaching out to us and including us.
All right, if you enjoyed that conversation, make sure to check out the action steps linked in the show notes. Consider donating to Soulfire Farm at soulfirefarm.org or go to the GoFundMe page I mentioned at the top. Links will be in the show notes. Check out Leah Penniman's book as well, Farming While Black. It's great. Check the links. Make a difference. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you Monday. Bye.